Known as the king of the elements, it is one of the building blocks of life.
It is the framework that all living things are built upon.
It's the backbone for everything.
It's central to our lives and everything that we have around us.
Carbon is one of the most abundant chemical elements in the universe.
Carbon is involved in all of the processes that allow growth of animals, plants. It's involved in photosynthesis and respiration. It's the key building block of forests, crops, agriculture, the food we eat.
It's a very important element, and so we as scientists are curious about how the carbon cycle works, when it goes from the atmosphere to the ocean to a land plant. We just trace the carbon from one major reservoir to the next and try to understand what controls that.
When carbon is in the atmosphere in its gaseous form, known as carbon dioxide, or CO2, it's involved in controlling Earth's climate. Since the last ice age, roughly 10,000 years ago, steady levels of CO2 in the atmosphere created a climate that allowed human civilization to flourish.
Because the sunlight hits the Earth wants to radiate energy back to space. And if it did that freely, we'd be a frigid planet. But because of the CO2 in the atmosphere, it's intercepting that light energy. It's like putting a blanket on at night and keeping yourself warm. So it's very important to the development of our civilization.
Earth has entered what some scientists call the Anthropocene, the age of humans. A time when human activities have lasting impacts on the planet.
With industrialization of the planet, we've seen that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has increased in relation to how much humans have used fossil fuels and generated CO2.
We print 10 billion tons of new carbon in the atmosphere every year.
Coal is made out of carbon, petroleum products are all made out of carbon, and it's the combustion of those that is bringing that carbon back to the atmosphere very, very rapidly. It took hundreds of millions of years to bring that carbon down into those energy reservoirs, such as coal, and we're almost instantaneously, on geologic timescales, returning it to the atmosphere. So that's a motivation for us to understand the carbon cycle. And about a third of what we add every year to the atmosphere of CO2 ends up in the ocean.
So that's a good thing that the oceans are taking up CO2 from the atmosphere, and there's less of a climate impact of that carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. But the more the oceans absorb CO2, the more that CO2 changes ocean chemistry with impact on the marine ecosystem.
What happens to CO2 after it enters the oceans? What role does carbon play in the sea?
Major funding for this program was provided by the Batchelor Foundation, encouraging people to preserve and protect America's underwater resources. And by Divers Direct, Emotion Sports, inspiring the pursuit of adventure and water sports. The Do Unto Others Trust. The William J. and Isabel G. Clark Foundation. And by the following: Lady Susanna P. Tweed and Carlton Tweed Charitable Foundation, Skip and Diane Day.
Bermuda. Famous for its pink sand beaches and maritime history, this tiny group of islands in the North Atlantic is a popular tourist destination. It's also home to the Bermuda Institute of Ocean Sciences, which runs one of the world's few long-term research projects examining biogeochemical cycles in the ocean.
BATS, or the Bermuda Atlantic Time Series Study Project, is a multidisciplined oceanographic time series which has been ongoing since October 1988. Okay, I'm going to go continue sampling.
Dr. Rod Johnson is a physical oceanographer who uses measurements and mathematical analysis to investigate the system.
Once a month, for a period of about 5 days, we venture about 80 kilometers southeast of Bermuda to our normal sampling location.
Yeah, you can go ahead and start pulling in there. We're going to work with what we got.
Once on that station, we conduct a whole series of different water quality measurements, looking at the ocean biology, ocean chemistry, and the ocean physics. The objectives of the project are to try to understand the month-to-month variations, the seasonal variability, the year-to-year variability, and also try to discern long-term change in the ocean.
All of the major oceans have vast areas that are similar to the Sargasso Sea. So it gives us insights on a much broader system than just this one location.
Dr. Dennis Hansel is a biogeochemist studying the ocean carbon cycle across the globe.
The BATS program is very important for the international science community to gain insights on the ocean carbon cycle.
I've been involved with BATS since BATS Cruise #1 and never looked back.
Researchers use a variety of different instruments to consistently observe the physical, chemical, and biological processes that are taking place in the ocean.
So right now we're just loading in the configuration file for the CTD.
The main sampling device is a CTD, which stands for conductivity, temperature, and depth. Attached to this electronic instrument, we will have 24 PVC Niskin bottles, and we'll actually profile down to full ocean depth for this device. The CTD component, or the electronics, that's continually sending data back to us on the ship, which we then compute salinity from, dissolved oxygen, fluorescence, which gives us an indication of the phytoplankton biomass in the water column. If you're not into the data, it's just a set of coloured lines that progress down the screen as the CTD drops and descends. Collectively, I've probably looked at tens of thousands. Every one that comes up, I can't wait to see the profile, because it's the first time that profile's ever been seen. In the last BATS station, we had high fluorescence, almost 0.25 level.
Yeah.
We're trying to understand what's going on in our ocean. And you see that profile and things start running through your brain. It's almost a puzzle in many ways. And the more profiles we collect, the more understanding we gather. Yeah, that is the true fascination. We go all the way to the bottom, and then on the return, we'll have distinct depths that we want to actually sample from. At those depths, we'll stop the CTD package, and then we're able to remotely fire some of these Niskin balls. Then when we get back to the surface, we're able to sample for the biogeochemical parameters, such as dissolved nutrients, and we also collect gases as well, dissolved oxygen, dissolved CO2. We also then sample a whole suite of particles in the water column.
All of these measurements allow researchers to better understand how various elements cycle through the oceans. Carbon is transported in two distinct ways. One is a physical process known as the solubility pump.
Part of the global Earth system is that CO2 and heat are continually exchanged between the atmosphere and ocean. When cold, dry air passes over a warmer ocean, the ocean will lose heat, gives it up to the atmosphere, and at the same time, CO2 may be absorbed by those waters. What happens to the ocean when it gives up heat to the air is that it cools.
And that cold water, as you move it to higher latitudes, it becomes denser and denser and denser. And if it gets to the far North Atlantic near Greenland, it becomes so dense that it finally sinks to the deep ocean.
There are places all across the global ocean, the North Pacific, the Arctic, the Southern Ocean, where there's this process of transfer of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to the surface of the ocean and then deeper into the depths of the ocean.
And then once it's down there, then it invades the interior of the ocean. It can be locked in the deep ocean for 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 3,000 years, depending on the path it takes.
Scientists can measure the age of the water by using a variety of tracers, such as naturally occurring radioactive carbon-14.
The sun is creating radioactive carbon, and it's in the CO2. It's a very, very low level of radioactivity. But once you take that CO2 and remove it from the atmosphere, it's just decaying with time. And it has a half-life of over 5,000 years. So you can look at the initial radioactivity of the water at the surface and then see that it's decreased as it circulates through the depths. And then by the radioactivity, you can say, well, how long has it been since it was at the surface when it had the more modern signature of radioactivity?
Currents move masses of deep water around the oceans.
Carbon dioxide that has been transferred to the deep ocean, for example in the North Atlantic, it finds its way through the South Atlantic into the Indian Ocean, into the Southern Ocean, and then into the Pacific Ocean. And eventually, in the Eastern Pacific, it will come again to the surface. It can come up in other places where we have what we call upwelling.
When that deep ocean water eventually works its way back to the surface, the water is warmed from the sun, and the solubility of CO2 in the water decreases. Then the CO2 gas wants to leave the water and go into the atmosphere.
So that's one of the ways that carbon is transferred through the global ocean. It's an amazing process. Before human influence on this process, the oceans and the atmosphere were in balance. But now the oceans take up a lot more CO2 than they release. So it's a change from what was in the natural environment before human activities to how the oceans work today. My specialty is trying to understand how carbon dioxide is transferred from the atmosphere to the oceans and vice versa. This machine measures the carbon dioxide concentrations of seawater. We're measuring CO2 very, very precisely. What that means is that we can see very small changes occurring over time. When we're observing the ocean every month, every year, what that allows us to do is to see the small changes that are associated with the increase of CO2 in the oceans due to uptake of human-produced CO2 in the atmosphere. Over the last 30 years, the levels of carbon dioxide in the water that we measure here has increased by about 30%. As CO2 is absorbed by the ocean, it changes this balance of acidity versus alkalinity. We're moving towards an acidified ocean with this absorption of CO2 in a process we call ocean acidification. So we see changes in what we call the pH of the ocean.
Another process through which carbon is cycled through the oceans is known as the biological pump.
Like forests, plants in the ocean photosynthesize. So we find most of the ocean plants, what we call phytoplankton, in the uppermost part of the ocean, where there's light.
To photosynthesize, the phytoplankton needs the CO2 that has dissolved into the top layer of the ocean from the atmosphere.
So once marine phytoplankton have taken up CO2 for photosynthesis, they've grown, they've reproduced, created a new generation. There are tiny animals we call zooplankton, and they will graze on phytoplankton, and that CO2 will return back to the ocean in this process we call respiration. However, a lot of the phytoplankton are not eaten and they die. They get repackaged in clumps of marine phytoplankton and they sink.
And it's not just clumps of dead phytoplankton that sink, but also fecal pellets released by the zooplankton.
And they might sink 100 meters, They might sink 5,000 meters. And as they sink, there's animals down there in the deep ocean who are waiting for some food to come by, a little particle, and they eat it. They get the energy from it, and then they respire the carbon back to CO2.
And that process of transferring organic matter to the deeper ocean allows that carbon to join in the global ocean circulation, the deep circulation. As this deep water gets older, it increases the levels of CO2 in that water. Eventually, after hundreds to thousands of years, that deep water, which is now rich in carbon dioxide, comes back to the surface.
So it's degassing to the atmosphere. The sun's warming it, it degasses more.
Scientists conduct a number of measurements to get a more detailed understanding of how the biological pump helps to sequester carbon into the deep ocean. One method involves sediment traps that are deployed off the back of the ship.
And these are designed to collect these biological aggregates that are falling out of the upper ocean.
Because of currents, particles sink at different angles.
You can have organic material produced in one spot of the ocean, but by the time it reaches the seabed, it can be thousands of kilometers away. So trying to understand how and where that material goes is absolutely a physics problem. But when it's sinking, it's also undergoing geochemical changes. And so it all becomes interconnected, and that's one of the most exciting things, is being on a multi-collaborative cruise where you have biologists, chemists, physicists, and we all have our individual specialties, but we're all trying to understand these processes in the ocean, and that's what drives us forward.
Coming up, a little bit more.
We've just recovered these sediment traps, and they were deployed in the ocean for 3 days. What we're looking to collect is the flux of material from the upper ocean. The filter that was on there has been then transferred into this Petri dish here. So when we get back to the laboratory, the flux on this filter is then weighed, and then is put through an elemental analyzer to determine the concentration of carbon and nitrogen there. We know how long the sediment trap was in the water, we know the concentration of this, and then we know how many milligrams per meter squared of the ocean per day was actually fluxing out during this past week.
In the waters near Bermuda, scientists have documented a pronounced seasonal cycle. During the winter months, as the surface layer of the ocean loses heat, it becomes heavier than the water below it, causing the waters to mix vertically. The deeper waters that come up are rich in nutrients, and as those nutrients reach the upper layer of the ocean, they support phyto and zooplankton blooms in the spring.
So shortly after spring phytoplankton bloom, there'll be a secondary zooplankton bloom, and that's when you tend to get far more zooplankton fecal pellets and dead material falling down.
One concern scientists have is that they're seeing less seasonal mixing of waters as water temperatures increase in the upper layer of the ocean. Since the 1950s, water temperatures have been recorded bi-weekly near Bermuda.
The evidence tells us that there are ups and downs in temperature, but over the past 60 years, the oceans have warmed by almost a degree Celsius.
If I tell you it's about 1/100th of a degree a year in the top 100 meters of the ocean, you think that's not a big number. If you relay it as wattage and integrate that number over the Sargasso Sea, that warming is then equivalent to all power stations in North America for just the Sargasso Sea. And it starts to put a scale on how much heat is becoming trapped in the ocean. Now, if we think of global warming and we reduce that amount of mixing, then that's less nutrients that can be brought to the surface and fuel productivity.
It changes what can grow because there's lower nutrients perhaps in an environment where there had been high nutrients. So the organisms that are there that can live under low nutrient conditions are different than the organisms that would live there under high nutrient conditions. And then the animals that depend on those organisms are going to be different. So it changes the ecosystem.
Scientists hypothesize that such a shift in the ecosystem could lead to less carbon being delivered into the deep ocean by the biological pump.
If you're not removing carbon from the upper ocean, then the concentration of carbon dioxide in the upper ocean can then get to a level where it'd be less sequestering of actual atmospheric carbon dioxide.
So there's more CO2 left in the atmosphere, and so that may reinforce the climate change impact of that carbon dioxide going forward.
NetTOES allows scientists to measure the amounts of plankton found at their study site, as well as to analyze the types of species found at different depths.
This is what a little eel juvenile looks like. And here's, some type of decapod, so shrimpy things. You can catch the different communities in the different areas. So by doing that on seasonal scales, we can look at what the community composition is made of and how those changes in community composition are going to influence that carbon flux. Are they good fecal pellet producers or not so much? There's quite a lot to be learned there. And we also don't really know the basic physiology of these organisms, and that's my specialty.
Dr. Amy Moss is an ecophysiologist studying the various zooplankton species collected on the BATS cruises.
This is a pteropod, a thecosome pteropod. It actually has two wings and they flap about, and their common name is sea butterfly. During the day, they're way down in the deep water, hiding from all their predators. And then at night, they all swim up to the surface where all their food is. And so we're interested in how that changes the movement of carbon, because they're eating surface carbon and then they're moving it down to depth. And we want to understand the dynamics of that, which species are going, how deep they're moving, how that changes with seasonal patterns. This group is interesting and important because it has this shell made out of calcium carbonate.
More acidic waters make it harder for some animals to create their calcium carbonate shells.
And these specific organisms tend to be really, really sensitive to those changes in pH, and so their shell can be affected.
Dr. Moss is using molecular tools to determine whether this species is genetically distinct from a similar animal that lives in areas of the Pacific where levels of CO2 are higher.
So if they're the same species, that says that this species might have less difficulty experiencing CO2 in the future. If they're different species, then that might mean that this species just isn't capable of responding to CO2 because over its evolutionary history, it hasn't experienced it for so long that it's, new, problematic. And there's certain places in the world that we already see substantial changes in these organisms. Their shells already show signs of dissolution. These are places like the poles and also upwelling regions, like off the coast of Oregon and Washington. In places like this, the acidification hasn't progressed far enough that we see changes in their shells. However, there's been work that's done with their genes, and those already show shifts. There's some physiological changes that are occurring in places like the Mediterranean, which is just as warm as here. I'm doing some work on these groups right now to try to understand how CO2 is going to affect them here.
Laboratory experiments allow scientists like Dr. Moss to expose plankton to conditions the oceans are predicted to experience in the future. The current hypothesis is that as ocean acidification worsens, some species of plankton will fare better than others.
We don't know enough yet about winners and losers to have a good sense, but we have concerns that we're seeing shifts in the size of organisms. We have concerns that we're seeing shifts in the types of organisms, and that these organisms play what we call a functional role. They have a job. They influence the export of carbon in a particular way. Some of them make big poop, some of them make small poop, and those things change how much carbon's moving out. And that's important because the oceans right now are taking up a lot of the extra CO2 that we're producing. If they stop being as efficient at that, that will have substantial implications for how quickly the terrestrial biosphere becomes destabilized by climate change. Right now, the ocean's acting as a really wonderful buffer for us, and we don't know how long that's going to last.
The oceans are a complex system. Teams of dedicated scientists have spent decades taking consistent measurements and conducting experiments to describe the processes that take place in their depths.
So the work we do here is really important for understanding how the oceans work.
And We're motivated on top of that by the changes that are going on. How's that going to be of consequence to me, to my children, and succeeding generations? Because the changes that we're putting into the system will be around for a long, long time.
An understanding of that long-term change is important for trying to figure out a framework for perhaps mitigating change, adapting to change, putting together policies that can protect the environment.
I want a future that's livable, and climate change really threatens that. It requires stewardship. It's part of our ecosystem, part of our home, and we need to take care of it. It's our responsibility.
Major funding for this program was provided by the Batchelor Foundation, encouraging people to preserve and protect America's underwater resources. And by Divers Direct, Emotion Sports, inspiring the pursuit of adventure and water sports. The Do Unto Others Trust. The William J. and Isabel G. Clark Foundation. And by the following: Lady Susanna P. Tweed and Carlton Tweed Charitable Foundation, Skip and Diane Day.